Welcome, you night traveler. Let the world grow quiet around you, and the weight of the day gently melt into the softness of your pillow. Tonight, we're not rushing anywhere. No alerts, no alarms. Just the slow, steady rhythm of history, unfolding like parchment under candlelight. Take a deep breath. Inhale the distant scent of damp earth, old wood and chimney smoke. Exhale the noise of the present. You're safe here, wrapped in shadows and story. Now dim the lights, nestle under the blankets, and allow me to guide you through nearly 1,000 years of transformation, war, poetry, and power. This is the tale of kings and peasants, of mud and marble, of glory and grief. It is a tale whispered through monasteries and across battlefields, etched in runestones and embroidered in tapestry. This is the entire history of medieval England, told softly, slowly, and completely. So before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Whisper Hollow for more journeys like this, and if your eyes are already growing heavy, that's perfectly fine, let them close. The story will keep going, whether you're awake or dreaming. Now let us begin. Chapter 1. The Shadows After Rome, 410–600 AD. In the fading light of a world where Rome's eagles no longer cast their shadows across Britain's shores, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The year was 410 AD. As the last Roman legions marched away from these misty islands, they left behind not just empty fortresses and decaying roads, but a vacuum, a silence in the center of the world's former order. With no emperor to answer to, no troops to protect the towns, the Romano-British population was left to fend for themselves. The once glittering province of Britannia fell into twilight. Gone were the organized cities, gone the heated baths and mosaics. What remained was a patchwork of petty kingdoms. Hill forts repurposed, villas crumbling beneath ivy, and roads beginning to disappear beneath weeds and fog. In this post-Roman world, local warlords rose to power. Some were native Britons, perhaps descendants of Romanized elites, while others were newcomers, Germanic mercenaries, brought over by the Britons themselves to defend against raiders from the north and west. But those mercenaries had ambitions of their own. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, Germanic peoples from what is now northern Germany and Denmark, began arriving in larger numbers. First hired as help, then arriving as conquerors, the island began to fracture. Imagine standing on a damp hill in 5th century Britain. The land is divided, not into England, Scotland, and Wales, but into a chaotic mosaic: Dumnonia, Powys, Bernicia, Lindsey, Kent, and others. Each ruled by a chieftain or petty king, each vying for survival. The native Britons called the newcomers Sais, the Saxons. They brought their own language, their own gods, and their own ideas of kingship. They worshipped deities like Woden and Thunor, gods of war and storm. And slowly, like tide over sand, they began to change the land forever. Place names shifted. Rivers were renamed. The Latin tongue faded. In its place rose a new language, early Old English, and with it, a new identity, not Roman, not Celtic, but something different. Angloland, the land of the Angles. Eventually, England, but it would not emerge easily. The centuries that followed were a crucible of battle, myth, and reinvention. It was in this age that legends took root. Tales of Arthur, the once and future king, said to have fought against the Saxon tide. Whether he was real or imagined, Arthur became a symbol of resistance, of longing, of something lost to time. By the year 600, much of southeastern Britain was under Anglo-Saxon control. The native Britons had been pushed west into what we now call Wales and Cornwall. The north, fierce and untamed, remained contested. The stage was set, the players were gathering. And the medieval world, with all its splendor and sorrow, was beginning to stir. Chapter 2. The Coming of the Cross, 600–700 AD. The darkness that settled over post-Roman Britain was not only political but spiritual. But then, like a spark in dry tinder, Christianity returned. Though Roman Christianity had once flickered here, it had largely vanished with the legions. Now, a new wave arrived, not from Rome, but from across the Irish Sea, and from distant Kent. In 597 AD, a monk named Augustine landed in Kent, under orders from Pope Gregory the Great. His mission? Convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons to the Christian faith. Backed by the powerful King Aethelbert of Kent, Augustine began his sacred task. He founded a church in Canterbury, one that would later become the center of English Christianity. But he wasn't alone. While Augustine worked in the south, Celtic Christian monks from Iona and Lindisfarne moved from the north. These were men of isolation and silence, of bare cells and windswept stone. They brought a harsher, more ascetic faith, rooted in old Irish monasticism, shaped by hardship and devotion. And in time, these two traditions collided. In 664, at the Synod of Whitby, a decision was made. The Roman tradition would dominate English Christianity. It was a subtle moment but a powerful one that yoked England closer to the great Christian powers of the continent. With the church came literacy. Latin returned, this time as the language of monks and scribes. Old poems and new scriptures were copied carefully in dark halls, lit only by candles. The monasteries became the keepers of knowledge. Faith also brought unity. Kings began to convert, and with conversion came legitimacy. To rule with the blessing of the church was to rule with divine right. The cross became as mighty as the sword. This wasn't yet one kingdom, but the seeds were there. Chapter 3. The Rise of the Kingdoms. 700–800 AD. Medieval England didn't emerge all at once. Instead, it was shaped by the slow consolidation of power among 7 major kingdoms. This era would later be called the Heptarchy, though in truth these kingdoms rose and fell in power, constantly jostling for supremacy. The major players were Northumbria, in the north, with its famed monastery at Lindisfarne, and its kings of war and learning. Mercia, powerful and central, its kings growing rich from tribute and conquest. Wessex to the south, still rising, but destined for greatness. And Kent, East Anglia, Essex and Sussex, smaller, but still influential. Of these, Mercia began to shine brightest under King Offa. Offa was no minor lord. He dreamed in empires. Around the year 780, he ordered the construction of Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork along the border with Wales. Some say it was for defense. Others say it was a statement. A visible physical mark of his rule, stretching over 80 miles. He minted coins bearing his name, built alliances with Charlemagne, and ruled with might and cunning. Some historians call him the first real king of all England, but shadows were growing in the east. Across the North Sea, long ships were being built. Chapter 4. The Viking Tide. 800–900 AD. It began with a monastery, as it so often did in these stories. In 793, Norse raiders landed at Lindisfarne, a holy island off the coast of Northumbria. They descended with fury and fire, slaughtering monks, looting gold, and shattering peace. It was a thunderclap. The Viking Age had begun. For decades to come, England would be shaped by the clash of Norse and Saxon. These were not just raids, they were invasions. The Danes in particular came in waves, seeking land, wealth, and legacy. They seized the east and north of England, carving out a region known as the Danelaw, where Norse customs and law reigned. Monasteries were burned. Towns were seized. But from the ashes, a hero emerged. Alfred of Wessex. Known today as Alfred the Great, he was one of the few rulers to truly stand against the Viking onslaught. In 878, after years of war, he defeated the Danes at the Battle of Edington and secured a tenuous peace. But Alfred did more than fight. He reformed the law, he translated Latin texts into Old English. He encouraged learning and education. He built a navy and fortified towns called burhs, the ancestors of many English cities today. Under Alfred, Wessex became a beacon, and the dream of a united England began to feel real. Chapter 5. One Kingdom to Rule. 900–1000 AD. After Alfred came his son Edward the Elder, then Athelstan, the first man to truly call himself king of all the English. Athelstan's reign marked a turning point. He defeated the combined forces of Scots, Vikings and Strathclyde Britons at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937. A clash so great it was immortalized in poems. His court became a place of learning and law. Royal charters were issued. Coins bore his image. Foreign rulers sent gifts. The old tribalism was fading. A new identity was emerging. But unity was fragile. Though the kings of Wessex claimed all England, Norse-held areas remained tense. In York, Danish rulers still held sway. The North remembered its old gods and old ways. Still, by the end of the 10th century, England was recognized across Europe as a powerful Christian kingdom. But peace, as always, would not last. Chapter 6. The Danes Return. Cnut, the Great and the North Sea Empire. 1000–1042 AD. The end of the first millennium did not bring peace to England. Instead, it brought storms of sails, steel, and ambition. The Viking raids that had terrorized the coasts for over a century returned with renewed fury. But this time, it was no longer about plunder. Now it was conquest. The Viking Age had entered its imperial phase. The English king at the time, Ethelred the Unready, struggled to fend off repeated invasions. His nickname doesn't mean what it seems. Unready is derived from the Old English unreid, meaning ill-advised. His reign was marred by indecision and disastrous choices. He attempted to buy peace with bribes of silver, called Danegeld, paying the very pirates he was meant to defeat. It worked, briefly, but silver only whetted the Norse appetite. In 1013, a powerful Danish king named Sweyn Forkbeard launched a full-scale invasion. By the end of that year, Sweyn had conquered nearly all of England and forced Ethelred to flee to Normandy. But Sweyn's reign was short. He died suddenly in 1014, and Ethelred returned to reclaim the throne. But Sweyn had a son, Cnut. Cnut, young and fierce, returned with a vengeance. After years of battle, he finally defeated Ethelred's successor, Edmund Ironside, in 1016. Rather than endless war, the two kings agreed to divide the kingdom. But within months Edmund died under mysterious circumstances, and Cnut took the entire crown. Thus began a unique chapter in English history, the reign of a Viking king. But Cnut the Great was no mere barbarian. He was brilliant, strategic, and politically savvy. He ruled not only England but Denmark and Norway, forming what historians call the North Sea Empire. Cnut married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, uniting rival claims. He adopted Christianity and supported the church lavishly, donating land and wealth to monasteries and appointing English clergy. He ruled with a delicate balance, part conqueror, part peacemaker. One of the most famous legends about Cnut is the tale of him commanding the tide to stop, not out of arrogance, but to demonstrate to his flattering courtiers that even a king's power had limits in the face of God and nature. Under Cnut, England experienced rare stability, but his sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, lacked his strength. The North Sea Empire began to crumble, and by 1042, the Wessex royal line was restored, bringing the mild and pious Edward the Confessor to the throne. The Viking chapter closed, but its influence endured in law, language, and legend. Chapter 7. Edward the Confessor and the Calm Before the Storm. 1042 to 1066 AD. When Edward the Confessor ascended the throne in 1042, many saw it as the return of rightful Saxon rule. Son of Ethelred and Emma of Normandy, Edward had spent much of his life in exile in Normandy. His return marked a moment of seeming unity, a calming of the chaos. But under the surface, tensions were building. Edward was deeply religious, often preferring prayer to politics. His court was filled with Norman advisors, which stirred resentment among the English nobility, especially among the powerful Godwin family. At the head of this family was Earl Godwin of Wessex, who had grown into one of the richest and most influential men in the kingdom. When Edward tried to limit Godwin's power, it sparked a brief crisis. Godwin was exiled but returned with force, and the king, unwilling to plunge the realm into war, restored his lands. When Godwin died, his son Harold Godwinson inherited the title, and Edward's quiet reliance on Harold grew over time. But there was one enormous problem: succession. Edward had no children. Some said he had taken a vow of chastity, others blamed political estrangement from his wife Edith, Godwin's daughter. Whatever the reason, there was no heir. And in the vacuum, powerful rivals began circling. Edward reportedly promised the throne to William, Duke of Normandy, his cousin. Yet later, he may have pledged it to Harold. Complicating matters further was a distant claim by Harald Hardrada, King of Norway. When Edward died on January 5, 1066, the future of England cracked wide open. The following day, Harold Godwinson was crowned king, the last crowned Anglo-Saxon monarch. Across the sea, William saw this as betrayal. And far to the north, Harald Hardrada readied his ships. 3 kings, 1 crown, and 1066 would decide it all. Chapter 8. The Norman Conquest, Hastings and the Turning Point, 1066 AD. The year 1066 stands alone in English history, a storm of blood, betrayal, and transformation. In September, Harald Hardrada of Norway invaded the north, with the support of Harold Godwinson's own brother Tostig. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold's forces caught them by surprise. Hardrada and Tostig were killed, and the Norwegian threat extinguished. But no rest was granted. Just 3 days later, William of Normandy landed on the southern coast with thousands of soldiers, horses, and papal banners. He claimed the English crown was his by promise, that Edward had named him heir, and that Harold had sworn loyalty to him on sacred relics. Harold, exhausted from the northern campaign, marched south. On October 14, 1066, the two armies met at a ridge near Hastings. It was a battle of endurance. The English formed a shield wall, impenetrable and stubborn, but William's Normans, using cavalry, archers, and feigned retreats, broke it by evening. Harold fell. Some say an arrow pierced his eye, immortalized in the Bayeux tapestry. Others say he was cut down, defending his crown to the last. By Christmas, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The Anglo-Saxon age was over, and the Normans began their reign. Chapter 9. Lords and Castles. Building the feudal web, 1067 to 1085 AD. William the Conqueror didn't just want the crown, he wanted control. To achieve it, he imposed feudalism with ruthless efficiency. Lands were seized from Anglo-Saxon lords and granted to Norman barons. In return, they owed him military service, taxes, and unwavering loyalty. The Norman elite spoke French. They built stone castles, symbols of dominance. The Tower of London, begun in 1078, still looms today as a relic of that era. Everywhere, new architecture rose: square towers, thick walls, arrow slits. Castles weren't just defenses, they were instruments of oppression and surveillance. The feudal pyramid placed William at the top. Below him were tenants-in-chief, barons and bishops, then knights, and finally peasants, serfs tied to the land, owing labor and produce. The church was both tool and ally. William filled bishoprics with Normans, and tightened royal control over monasteries. Anglo-Saxon culture was not erased, but it was submerged. English remained the tongue of peasants. French ruled the court and law. This shift in power echoed for generations, and in his twilight years, William wanted to know exactly what he controlled. Chapter 10. The Domesday Book and William's Final Judgment, 1085 to 1087 AD. In 1085, William ordered a survey unlike any before in English history. He sent teams across the realm to record everything: who owned what land, how many oxen they had, what mills they ran, how many villagers lived there. Every pig, acre, and slave was counted. The result was the Domesday Book, named because, like Judgment Day, its rulings were final. Completed in 1086, it listed over 13,000 settlements. For modern historians, it's a priceless time capsule. But to those living under William's rule, it was a symbol of absolute authority. The Domesday Book showed William's grip on England was near total. When he died in 1087, the kingdom passed to his son William II, known as William Rufus. But the Norman machine, feudal, fortified, and foreign, continued rolling. The conquest was complete. Yet even now, beneath the Norman surface, Old England pulsed. Its language survived in whispers, its customs in the countryside. And soon, the Plantagenet era would awaken it once more. Chapter 11. The Anarchy and a Queen's Crown, 1100 to 1154 AD. As the candle of the 11th century flickered low, a quiet tension crept through the halls of England's castles. It was not the kind of tension born from loud battle cries or distant armies. No, this was a subtler unease, a sense that the stability so hard won under the Normans was once again unraveling. King William the Conqueror had passed his crown to his sons, but as with many royal lines, peace among heirs was fleeting. His youngest son, Henry I, took the throne in 1100. Stern, calculating, and deliberate, Henry ruled with a firm hand. His reign brought administrative stability, and he worked tirelessly to weld together the fragile Norman kingdom, one built as much from fear as from loyalty. But beneath the order he imposed, destiny plotted something else. In 1120, the waters of the English Channel swallowed more than a ship. They swallowed the future of a dynasty. The White Ship tragedy is one of the most haunting footnotes in English history. That night, Henry's only legitimate son and heir, William Adelin, along with a host of noble youths and courtiers, boarded the White Ship to cross from Normandy to England. The ship, manned by a drunken crew, struck submerged rocks and sank in icy darkness. Almost everyone aboard perished. One passenger, a butcher by some accounts, lived to tell the tale. William Adelin, the pride and promise of England, did not. King Henry was never the same. He had other children, many in fact, but only one other legitimate child, a daughter named Matilda, sometimes called Empress Maud for her marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor. In a move that was radical for its time, Henry declared that she, a woman, would inherit his throne. The barons, uneasy but obedient, swore fealty to her. But when Henry died in 1135, those oaths proved thin as parchment. The nobles hesitated. Could a woman truly rule England alone? Many believed the realm would collapse. Into this uncertainty stepped Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew. Affable, charming, and eager for power. Supported by many nobles, Stephen claimed the crown for himself. And so began a period the chroniclers would later call simply the anarchy. The word itself evokes what followed. Lawlessness, shifting allegiances, starvation, siege. The entire kingdom seemed to fracture. Nobles built unauthorized castles and carved out private fiefdoms. Bandits roamed the forests. Peasants prayed not for good harvests but for peace. In the south, Stephen's forces held sway. But in the west, Matilda raised her standard, supported by her half-brother, the fierce and loyal Robert of Gloucester. Their power base was strong, and Matilda, though surrounded by male rivals, proved relentless. In 1141, her fortunes turned sharply. At the Battle of Lincoln, Stephen was captured. Matilda entered London and prepared for coronation. But fate, again, proved cruel. The Londoners rose against her, resentful of her imperious manner and punitive taxes. She fled, and Stephen, through a prisoner exchange, returned to the throne. The war dragged on. In one of the most dramatic episodes of this civil war, Matilda was besieged in Oxford Castle in the dead of winter. Surrounded, starving and hopeless, she escaped under cover of night. Dressed in white to blend with snow, she crossed the frozen River Thames and slipped away, unseen by the king's forces. But despite her bravery, Matilda could not secure the throne outright. In 1148, she returned to Normandy, her cause passed on to her son, Henry Plantagenet. Charismatic and brilliant even in youth, Henry crossed the Channel in 1153 with a small army, ready to claim his mother's birthright. England was exhausted. The nobles, weary of war, brokered a compromise. Stephen would remain king until his death, but he would name Henry as his heir, bypassing his own blood. The following year, in 1154, Stephen died. After nearly 20 years of war and uncertainty, England exhaled. The crown passed to a young man whose name would echo through the centuries, Henry II. And Matilda? She never wore the crown, but she changed the very definition of what a woman could be in England's political arena. Empress. Warrior. Mother of a dynasty. A queen in all but name. Chapter 12. The Plantagenets' Rise. Henry II. Lawgiver and rebel king. 1154 to 1189 AD. When King Stephen died in 1154, England was worn thin. Its fields trampled, its noble houses divided, its peasants buried beneath the weight of 2 decades of civil war. What followed was not so much the passing of a torch, but the lifting of a veil, one that revealed the battered kingdom beneath. And into this weary land rode a red-haired, restless young man, Henry Plantagenet. He was 21 years old, already Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, and newly crowned Henry II, King of England. But Henry was no ordinary heir. He was the product of both fierce ambition and royal blood, the son of Empress Matilda, granddaughter of William the Conqueror, and Geoffrey of Anjou, a hardened nobleman whose emblem was the sprig of broom, Plantagenista, from which the Plantagenet name would rise. From the very first day of his reign, Henry set about putting the shattered pieces of England back together. He restored royal authority, demolished the illegal castles built during the anarchy, and imposed order where chaos had ruled. But Henry was not merely a warrior king. He was something rarer, a lawgiver. His passion for justice was as hot as his legendary temper. He traveled constantly, refusing to sit idle in castles. He preferred the saddle to the throne, often sleeping on cloaks rather than cushions. He carried with him a vision, a kingdom where the law was king, not just the king's will. Henry's most important reforms lay in the realm of justice. Under his reign, the common law system took shape, a unifying framework that applied royal justice across all of England. He established itinerant justices, royal judges who traveled the country holding assizes, hearings of disputes in shires and towns. He created procedures that bypassed the old feudal courts, allowing ordinary people to appeal directly to the Crown's justice. And crucially, Henry introduced the concept of the jury of presentment, a group of local men sworn to report crimes in their community. It was the ancestor of the modern grand jury, and a symbol of the growing idea that law should be public, consistent, and accountable. But Henry's reforms struck a nerve, especially with the Church. At the heart of this growing conflict was the question of clerical immunity. Should priests accused of crimes be tried in church courts, where punishments were light and protections vast, or in the king's courts, under secular law? Henry believed all subjects, even clergy, should answer to royal justice, but the Church saw this as an encroachment. And then, there was Thomas Becket. Becket had once been Henry's close friend and loyal chancellor. Witty, worldly, and brilliant, the king saw in him a man who could bridge the gap between throne and altar. And so, in 1162, Henry made him Archbishop of Canterbury, assuming Becket would support royal policy. But Becket changed. The moment he took holy orders, he abandoned his lavish lifestyle, donned a hair shirt, and became a champion of the Church. He defied the king repeatedly, especially over the Constitutions of Clarendon, a set of laws that sought to restrict ecclesiastical privilege. Their friendship curdled into rivalry. Henry fumed. Becket fled to France. For years a cold war simmered. Letters, threats, reluctant truces. Finally, Becket returned in 1170, supposedly reconciled. But tensions flared again. Then came one of history's most chilling moments. In December of that year, Henry, furious and frustrated, reportedly cried out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights heard him. Interpreting the king's rage as command, they rode to Canterbury and confronted Becket at the cathedral. He did not run, he did not plead. They struck him down at the altar. One blow cracked his skull, another scattered his brains across the stones. The realm recoiled in horror. Becket was instantly martyred. Miracles were reported at his tomb. Pilgrims flocked to Canterbury. Henry, realizing the gravity of the act, intentional or not, performed public penance, walking barefoot to Becket's shrine and allowing monks to scourge him. The event cast a long shadow over Henry's legacy. His legal reforms endured, but his feud with the Church would haunt him. And there were other shadows forming. Henry had married one of the most remarkable women in European history, Eleanor of Aquitaine. A duchess in her own right, Eleanor had previously been married to Louis VII of France, with whom she had 2 daughters. But after a failed crusade and a loveless union, they divorced, a scandal at the time. She then married Henry and bore him 8 children, including Richard and John. Their marriage, at first passionate, became tumultuous. Eleanor was fiercely independent and politically astute. When Henry began openly favoring mistresses and sidelining her influence, the tension between them boiled into outright rebellion. In 1173, Henry the young king, their son, crowned in Henry's lifetime but given no real power, rebelled against his father. Eleanor supported her sons, as did many barons and foreign allies. Henry crushed the rebellion, but at great cost. He imprisoned Eleanor in various castles for over 15 years, allowing her only limited freedom. The family tore itself apart. Geoffrey, another son, died in a tournament. Richard became estranged from his father, and John, Henry's youngest, played both sides, at times loyal, at times treacherous. By the late 1180s, Henry was old, ill, and surrounded by betrayal. In 1189, Richard allied with Philip II of France, Henry's great rival. Together, they forced the aging king into submission. Sick, broken, and deserted, even by John, Henry retreated to Chinon Castle in Anjou. There, in July, he died. He reportedly asked to be buried in his riding boots, sword at his side, still a king in death. Henry II's reign was one of transformation. He laid the legal foundations of modern England. He tamed a lawless realm. And he ruled an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. But he also sowed the seeds of future conflict, with his sons, with the Church, and with France. He was, in the words of one chronicler, a man of ceaseless energy, bold in action, swift in decision, but also, in the end, alone. And as the crown passed to his son, the legendary Richard the Lionheart, the kingdom once again stood at a crossroads. Chapter 13. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of Two Kingdoms, 1122–1204. Before knights sang songs of courtly love, before queens were seen as rulers in their own right, before chivalry shaped the code of kings and poets. There was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her name echoes across the centuries like a banner in the wind. Brilliant, controversial, unstoppable. Few women, few people, shaped medieval Europe more than she did. Born in 1122, in the lush and cultured Duchy of Aquitaine, Eleanor inherited vast lands and immense power at just 15 years old. Aquitaine was not a remote, rural holding. It was one of the richest and most sophisticated territories in France, filled with castles, vineyards, and courts that celebrated poetry and refinement. The culture there was vibrant, secular, and steeped in southern traditions far removed from the rigid north. Her father, Duke William X, ensured she was well educated. She could read Latin, had studied classical literature, and was well versed in the legal and diplomatic matters of court. She grew up among troubadours and philosophers, with the rhythms of music and law swirling around her. Upon her father's sudden death, Eleanor became Duchess of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest heiresses in all of Christendom. Immediately, she was placed under the guardianship of the French king, Louis VI, who arranged for her to marry his son Louis VII, just weeks later. At 15, Eleanor became Queen of France. But this union, regal though it was, proved deeply flawed. Louis VII was a deeply pious man, raised to be a monk before his brother's death placed him in line for the crown. Where Eleanor was lively, sharp, and worldly, Louis was devout, awkward, and introspective. Their personalities clashed, and their court became a theatre of constant tension. Still, they produced 2 daughters, Marie and Alix, and ruled jointly for over a decade. In 1147, the couple joined the Second Crusade, an ambitious and ultimately disastrous attempt to reclaim the Holy Land. Eleanor insisted on accompanying Louis, bringing with her a large entourage of knights from Aquitaine. Some chroniclers claimed she dressed in armor and led troops. Others accused her of impropriety with her own uncle, Raymond of Antioch. What's certain is that tensions with Louis escalated in the east. The crusade failed miserably. On their return journey, their relationship unraveled completely. In 1152, after 15 years of marriage, the Pope granted them an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity. They were distant cousins. Eleanor, once again unmarried, retained all her lands and titles. She was now the most eligible woman in Europe, and just 8 weeks later, she married a younger man, a powerful duke from Anjou, Henry Plantagenet, future King of England. She was 30, he was 19. When Henry ascended the English throne in 1154, Eleanor became Queen of England, making her one of the only women in history to be crowned queen in 2 major European kingdoms. Their union was initially passionate. Over the next 13 years, she bore Henry 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters, including future kings Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. But Eleanor was more than a mother. She governed her own lands independently, issued charters, oversaw courts, and remained an active political player. She was not content to fade into the background. She traveled across England and France, acted as regent in Henry's absence, and played the intricate game of medieval diplomacy with unmatched skill. Yet as the years passed, the royal marriage deteriorated. Henry's string of affairs, most notably with Rosamund Clifford, the fair Rosamund of legend, humiliated Eleanor. His attempts to dominate Aquitaine without her input enraged her further. She returned to her ancestral lands in Poitiers and created a new court, one that became the cultural heart of Western Europe. Here she patronized troubadours, philosophers, and poets. Here, the concept of courtly love, with its rituals of admiration, longing, and moral virtue, was elevated. Whether Eleanor herself created these ideals is debated, but her influence on the development of chivalric culture is undeniable. She was, for a time, the queen of not just lands, but of literature. But Eleanor was not finished shaping history. In 1173, a rebellion broke out. Her sons, Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, all grew resentful of their father. Henry had crowned young Henry as co-ruler, but gave him no real authority. The brothers saw their inheritance slipping through their fingers. Eleanor, caught between loyalty to her husband and her sons, chose the latter. She encouraged, perhaps even organized, the rebellion. Henry crushed it. The young princes were defeated. Geoffrey and Richard were forced into submission. John, still a boy, was spared. And Eleanor? She was arrested, betrayed by her own couriers, and taken prisoner by her husband. For the next 15 years, she lived in royal custody, not in a dungeon, but confined to castles in Salisbury, Winchester, and elsewhere. She was allowed visitors, occasionally joined court functions, but remained under watch. She was queen. And a prisoner. It wasn't until Henry's death in 1189 that Eleanor regained her full freedom, and from that moment she took command once more. Her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, became king. But Richard had no interest in ruling England. He spent most of his reign on the Third Crusade, leaving Eleanor as regent in his absence. She was now in her 60s, yet she travelled constantly, managing the affairs of state, collecting taxes, issuing royal charters, negotiating with the church, and even dealing with foreign kings. When Richard was captured and held for ransom by the Holy Roman Emperor, it was Eleanor who raised the funds for his release, a staggering 150,000 marks, and delivered the payment in person. Her diplomacy held the realm together. Even after Richard's death in 1199, Eleanor remained a powerful force, guiding the accession of her youngest son, John. She arranged alliances, settled disputes, and even journeyed across the Pyrenees, at age 77, to escort her granddaughter to a royal wedding in Castile. Only in her final years did she retreat, retiring to the Abbey of Fontevraud in Anjou, where she had long planned to be buried. There, she continued to advise kings, write letters, and reflect on a life that had spanned 8 decades, 2 marriages, 10 children, 2 crowns, and nearly every corner of medieval Europe. She died in 1204, at the age of 82. Eleanor's legacy is as vast as her lands once were. She redefined queenship, not as a consort, but as a sovereign power. She nurtured a culture that gave rise to knightly romance, the chivalric code, and the ideals of love and honor. Her descendants ruled England and much of Europe for centuries. She was grandmother to Blanche of Castile, mother of Richard and John, and foremother to the Plantagenet, Lancastrian and Yorkist lines. In a world dominated by men, Eleanor carved out a throne of her own. And in the dim candlelit abbey where she lies, beside Henry II and Richard the Lionheart, her stone effigy still rests with a book in her hand, reading. Forever. Chapter 14. Richard the Lionheart, the Crusader king who left England behind, 1189 to 1199 AD. The bells of Westminster rang with rare clarity on a summer morning in 1189. The city was thick with pilgrims, nobles, and merchants. Streets were scattered with flowers. Children chased chickens between the cloaks of knights. Women whispered prayers at shrines. And the crowd pressed tightly along the procession route, waiting, watching for a glimpse of the new king. His name was already legendary. Richard Plantagenet, known to his people, and to his enemies, as the Lionheart. He was not just a monarch, he was a warrior, a crusader, a myth made flesh. But for all the pride and promise that swept through England that day, few understood just how little of their new king they would ever see. Richard I, crowned in 1189 at the age of 32, inherited not only a kingdom, but a dynasty bruised by rebellion and treachery. He was the third legitimate son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and had spent his youth not in England, but in Aquitaine, his mother's ancestral duchy. Richard was tall, fair-haired, and possessed of intense charisma. He was fluent in several languages, including Latin, Occitan, and French, but likely spoke little English. He was known for his passion for poetry, architecture, and, above all, war. From a young age he led armies, he fought rebels, he put down barons. He defied his father, stood with his mother, and carved his own legend in blood. So when he took the throne, Richard did not pause to savor it. He had a vow to fulfill. He had taken the cross, the sacred promise to fight for Jerusalem in the Third Crusade, and he meant to keep it. Within months of his coronation, Richard was raising taxes, selling offices, and emptying treasuries, not to enrich himself, but to fund an expedition that would carry him thousands of miles east. He joined forces with Philip II of France, his rival ally, and set out in 1190 for the Holy Land. The journey alone was epic. A storm blew Richard's fleet across the Mediterranean, and he landed in Sicily, where he spent months restoring order and negotiating with local powers. Then, while en route to the Levant, his ship was wrecked off Cyprus. The island's ruler insulted Richard's fiancée, Berengaria of Navarre, so Richard invaded the island, captured it in a week, and married Berengaria there. She became Queen of England in a chapel far from English shores, and would rarely ever see them. When Richard finally arrived in the Holy Land, he was greeted as a hero. His enemy was none other than Saladin, the great Muslim sultan, cultured, devout, and brilliant. The two men would never meet in person, but their rivalry became the stuff of legend. Richard proved a fierce commander. At the Siege of Acre he coordinated land and naval assaults, holding off starvation and disease. After the city surrendered, tensions flared between the Christian factions over prisoners and promises. In a ruthless show of strength, Richard ordered the execution of over 2,000 Muslim prisoners, marching them outside the city and beheading them before Saladin's forces. A message of terror and resolve. His most famous victory came at the Battle of Arsuf in 1191. Despite being ambushed in a forest by Saladin's cavalry, Richard kept his army disciplined, leading a counterattack with a sword in each hand, cutting down enemies on foot. He had to be physically restrained from chasing the retreating army alone. Even Saladin admired him. Their war was both brutal and strangely courteous. They exchanged gifts. Richard once offered Saladin's sister in marriage to his own brother. When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent fruit and his own doctor. But though he won battles, Richard could not retake Jerusalem. The holy city was too well defended. Supplies were short. Christian forces were divided. In the end, Richard negotiated a truce. Christian pilgrims could visit Jerusalem freely, but it would remain in Muslim hands. In 1192, Richard began the long journey home. He had spent barely 6 months in England since his coronation. The voyage home was not smooth. A storm scattered his ships, and he travelled in disguise through Europe. But near Vienna, he was recognized and captured by Leopold of Austria, a rival from the Crusade whom Richard had insulted. Leopold handed him over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who demanded a staggering 150,000 marks, the equivalent of several years of England's income, for his release. Back home, Richard's younger brother John, hungry for power, schemed with Philip of France to keep Richard imprisoned. But Eleanor of Aquitaine, now nearly 70, rallied the realm. She taxed the nobility, melted royal treasures, and raised the ransom, 1 coin, 1 jewel at a time. In 1194, Richard was freed. He returned to England briefly, long enough to suppress John's rebellion and reaffirm his rule. Then he left again, never to return. The rest of Richard's life was spent fighting in France, defending his continental lands from Philip. He built fortresses, commanded armies, and battled tirelessly to protect the Plantagenet Empire. In 1199, while besieging the tiny castle of Chalais-Chabrol in central France, a petty conflict over a rumoured treasure, Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt in the shoulder. The wound became infected. He lingered for days, in agony. Knowing the end was near, he forgave the boy who shot him, and then, with the silence of a setting sun, died at the age of 41. He was buried at Fontevraud Abbey, beside his father, Henry II, and later his mother, Eleanor. His heart, fittingly, was buried in Rouen, the capital of Normandy. Richard's reign lasted 10 years. He spent less than one in England. He spoke little English, raised taxes ruthlessly, emptied the treasury, and yet, he became a legend. He was immortalized in ballads and books, praised by troubadours, remembered as the ideal Christian knight, brave, pious and chivalrous. Even centuries later, English kings would be measured against the Lionheart. But the truth is more complex. He was a brilliant commander, yes, but a poor administrator. A foreign king to many of his subjects. He left behind no heirs, no plan for succession, and a kingdom worn thin by war and debt. He gave England glory, but not stability. That burden would fall to his brother. Chapter 15. King John and the Birth of Liberty, 1199 to 1216 AD. The bells that tolled for Richard the Lionheart in 1199 rang with both mourning and uncertainty. The great Crusader king had left behind no legitimate heir, no final testament, no carefully drawn map for the future. And so, into that silence stepped a shadow. His name was John, youngest son of Henry II, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, brother to the lion-hearted Richard, once called Lackland, because, as the youngest, he was never expected to inherit anything at all. Now, he would inherit a kingdom, but the crown sat heavy on his brow, and soon, it would slip. King John began his reign with promise. He was clever, educated, and experienced. Unlike Richard, he had spent time in England and spoke the language. He understood administration, the courts, the coinage. He knew how the gears of government turned. But John's mind was also marked by suspicion. He had betrayed his father, rebelled against his brother, and schemed with France. And now, as king, he trusted few and alienated many. His reign would be defined not by heroism, but by loss, of lands, of allies, and of royal prestige. The greatest loss came early. In 1202, Arthur of Brittany, a teenage nephew with a claim to the throne, rose in rebellion against John, backed by Philip II of France. John captured Arthur near the Norman border and imprisoned him in Rouen. Then, one night, Arthur vanished. Rumors spread quickly that John had murdered him with his own hands, that the boy's body was thrown into the Seine, that a future of Plantagenet unity had drowned in that dark water. Whether the stories were true or not, the damage was done. Many French nobles turned against John. Over the next few years, John lost Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, nearly all his continental possessions. The English crown, once straddling two great realms, was now confined to the island. Hence the bitter joke, from King of half France to King John of England. But the loss of land was only the beginning. To fund his wars and failed campaigns, John raised taxes steeply, imposing scutage, a payment that knights and barons could make in lieu of military service. It had been done before, but never with such frequency or fury. He fined nobles for inherited estates, demanded outrageous fees for justice, and sold wardships and marriages like auction lots. Forest laws were enforced harshly, punishing poachers and peasants with mutilation and prison. At the same time, John's paranoia deepened. He built up networks of spies, confiscated lands, forced nobles to offer hostages, even their own children, as pledges of loyalty. Some were imprisoned, others simply vanished. But the greatest confrontation came not with nobles, but with the Church. In 1205, the position of Archbishop of Canterbury became vacant. John refused to accept the Pope's nominee, Stephen Langton, and tried to install his own candidate. Pope Innocent III responded by placing England under an interdict in 1208, a spiritual lockdown. Churches closed. Bells went silent. No marriages, baptisms, or burials could take place in sacred ground. For 6 years, England lived in spiritual darkness. Then, in 1209, the Pope excommunicated John himself, cutting him off from the Church entirely. Isolated and desperate, John finally surrendered in 1213. In an astonishing reversal, he gave England to the Pope as a fiefdom, swearing fealty to Rome, and receiving it back as a vassal. The Pope, satisfied, lifted the interdict and excommunication. But John's nobles were horrified. To them, it was humiliation. Their king had sold the kingdom to a foreign bishop. The resentment, long smouldering, now caught flame. In 1214, John launched a final campaign to reclaim his French lands. At the Battle of Bouvines, his allies were decisively crushed. The war was lost. The treasury, empty. The barons, furious. By 1215, their patience had ended. A rebel army, made up of some of England's most powerful lords, marched on London. John, caught between rebellion and ruin, met them at a riverside meadow called Runnymede. There, on June 15, 1215, he affixed his seal to a parchment that would echo through time, the Magna Carta. The document was not revolutionary in intent. It was not a declaration of democracy. It was a list of grievances, promises that John would stop overtaxing, respect baronial rights, protect church privileges, and consult nobles on matters of taxation and law. But embedded within it were seeds of a new idea, that even the king was subject to the law, that rights could be written down, demanded, and defended, that tyranny could be curbed, not by rebellion, but by parchment. Clause 39 of the Magna Carta would become its most famous. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. In time, it would inspire constitutions, revolutions, and declarations far beyond England's shores. But in 1215, it was merely the beginning of another war. John had no intention of honoring the charter. He appealed to the Pope, who annulled it. Civil war erupted once again, the First Barons' War. The rebel barons invited Prince Louis of France to take the English throne. He landed with troops, occupied London, and was declared king in all but name. England teetered. And then, suddenly, John died. In October 1216, while traveling in eastern England, he contracted dysentery, an agonizing, humiliating illness. Some claimed he died of gluttony. Others whispered he had been cursed. In one final symbolic act, he lost the royal treasure, including the crown jewels, in the tidal estuary of the Wash, swallowed by quicksand and salt. He died days later at Newark Castle, broken and bloated, clutching his crown. He was 49 years old. King John's legacy is complicated. He was cruel, cunning, and deeply unpopular, even in his own time. Chroniclers called him foul as it were hell. Legends painted him as a tyrant. Robin Hood's stories cast him as the villain. And yet his failures gave rise to one of history's greatest documents. His reign marks the moment when English kingship changed from absolute rule to negotiated power. The Magna Carta would be reissued, revised, and eventually embraced as a cornerstone of English liberty. From John's ruin came reform. From his tyranny, a tether. From the shadow of his crown, a new kind of England would emerge, one ruled not only by kings, but by law. Chapter 16. Henry III and the Birth of Parliament, 1216 to 1272 AD. When King John died in the autumn of 1216, England was broken, divided by civil war, threatened by a foreign prince, and haunted by the memory of a king who had ruled through fear. But from that darkness came an unexpected moment of unity. Because John had left behind something rare, a child, a boy of 9 years old, crowned hurriedly in Gloucester Abbey, far from London, with a makeshift circlet. Because the crown jewels had been lost in the wash, his name was Henry, and with him began one of the longest reigns in English history. Henry III ruled for 56 years, a lifetime on the throne. But his reign was not one of conquest or crusade. It was a slow, often uneasy evolution, a turning of the wheel from medieval monarchy toward something new, fragile and astonishing. It was during his rule that Parliament, in its earliest form, began to take shape. But that would not come without struggle. At first, Henry's realm was held together not by his own strength, but by the wisdom of others. His regents, most notably William Marshal, the aged and noble Earl of Pembroke, rallied the realm, reissued the Magna Carta, and persuaded the rebel barons to abandon Prince Louis of France. Marshal's death in 1219 marked the end of an era. But Henry, still a teenager, was now eager to rule in his own right. He was pious, cultured, and deeply attached to the ideal of kingship, more myth than method. He believed in divine authority, sacred ceremony, and the importance of church and chivalry. But he lacked the forceful temperament of his Plantagenet forebears. He surrounded himself with foreign advisers, particularly his Lusignan half-brothers from his mother's side, and lavished wealth on foreign favorites. His court became known for extravagance and pageantry, even as his barons struggled under growing taxes and royal debts. Henry's greatest passion was religion. He poured immense resources into church building, none more magnificent than the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey in the Gothic style, designed to rival the great cathedrals of France. He commissioned statues, shrines, and relics, especially of Edward the Confessor, whom he admired so deeply he tried to emulate his saintly manner. But while the abbey rose in stone and light, the realm below it strained. Henry's military ambitions, including failed attempts to reclaim his family's French territories, cost dearly. He often borrowed vast sums from Italian bankers, and taxed the barons heavily to repay them. He even pledged English revenues to the Pope to fund foreign campaigns that had little to do with England itself. Tensions boiled over in the 1250s. A new voice began to rise. Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, was a French-born noble, married to Henry's sister and once a trusted ally. But he grew disillusioned with the king's mismanagement, favoritism, and disregard for baronial counsel. In 1258, Simon and a group of barons forced Henry to accept the provisions of Oxford, a charter that called for regular councils of barons, oversight of royal appointments, and limits on the king's ability to raise taxes unilaterally. It was a bold step. It was not just a restatement of Magna Carta, it was the first formal assertion of baronial control over royal governance. Henry reluctantly agreed, then maneuvered to have the Pope annul it. The country once again veered toward civil war. In 1264 the barons rebelled. Simon de Montfort led an army against the king and his son Prince Edward. At the Battle of Lewes, Simon's forces triumphed. King Henry was captured. Prince Edward was taken hostage. For over a year Simon ruled England in the king's name, effectively the first non-royal ruler of the realm. And in 1265, he summoned a revolutionary parliament. This parliament included not only barons and bishops, but also 2 knights from each shire, and for the first time, representatives from boroughs. It was the first time the common people, townsmen and gentry, had a voice in royal council. It wasn't democracy, it wasn't even equality, but it was the beginning of representation. And it would never fully vanish again. But Simon's power could not last. In August 1265, Prince Edward escaped captivity and raised an army loyal to the crown. At the Battle of Evesham, Simon was defeated and killed, his body mutilated by soldiers who saw him as a traitor. Henry was restored, but something had changed. Though he reasserted authority, Henry never regained the full confidence of his barons, and Parliament, that strange, fragile assembly born of rebellion, became a permanent feature of English life. When Henry died in 1272, his son Edward was away on crusade. But the transition was peaceful. There was no civil war, no rival claimant, no blood spilled for the crown. The realm had begun to accept a radical idea. That power did not only come from the sword, it could also come from agreement. From paper. From parley. From Parliament. Chapter 17. Edward I. Hammer of the Scots and builder of empire. 1272 to 1307 AD. The year was 1272, and England had waited nearly 2 months without a crowned king. Henry III had died quietly in Westminster, and his son, Prince Edward, was hundreds of miles away, deep in the Holy Land on the Ninth Crusade. But unlike the chaos that had followed previous royal deaths, there was no rebellion, no rival claimant, no panic in the streets. For the first time in England's history, the people simply declared, "The king is dead. Long live the king." Even in absence, Edward's authority was accepted. He returned in 1274, and was crowned Edward I, tall, golden-haired and fiercely intelligent, a warrior by blood and upbringing, a reformer by instinct, a king who believed not just in order, but in dominion. And he would soon transform England, and its neighbors, in ways that would echo for centuries. Edward's early reign was surprisingly calm and constructive. He reissued the Magna Carta, reconfirming its promises. But he also launched a sweeping set of legal reforms. New statutes were passed, laws about land ownership, inheritance, debt, and justice, helping create the framework of English common law that would endure for generations. He strengthened royal courts, standardized procedures, and sent royal justices to travel the kingdom. Justice, Edward believed, should not be locked away in castles. It should ride the roads with the people. But Edward was no soft-handed ruler. He also believed deeply in royal authority and conquest, and his ambition would soon draw his gaze beyond England's green hills. His first target was Wales. For centuries, the mountainous western lands had resisted full English control. Local princes ruled fractured territories. The English had claimed overlordship in name, but not in reality. That changed with Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, Prince of Gwynedd, who refused to pay homage to Edward. Edward responded, not with a message, but with an army. In 1277, and again in 1282, he marched deep into the Welsh heartlands, building roads, deploying troops, and systematically dismantling resistance. After Llewellyn was killed in ambush, Edward seized full control. And he made his conquest permanent. Across Wales he built massive stone castles, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, and more, engineering marvels and symbols of domination. Some were designed to echo imperial Roman architecture, with eagle motifs and colonnades, as if to say, the empire had returned. In 1301, Edward made his son, Prince of Wales, a title that every heir to the English crown has held since. But Edward's ambition didn't stop there. In 1290, the throne of Scotland was left vacant after the death of King Alexander III, and his heir, a child known as the Maid of Norway. The Scottish nobles asked Edward to arbitrate between rival claimants. He agreed, but demanded that they recognize him as overlord of Scotland. One claimant, John Balliol, agreed. He was crowned king in 1292, but his loyalty proved shallow. When Edward summoned him to support a campaign in France, Balliol refused. The Scottish lords rebelled. Edward's response was swift and brutal. In 1296, he marched north, sacked the town of Berwick, killed thousands, and stripped Scotland of its crown and the Stone of Destiny, the sacred coronation stone, which he sent to Westminster Abbey. He declared himself King of Scotland, but Scotland would not submit. In the Highlands and Glens, resistance grew, led by men whose names would become legend. First came William Wallace, a minor noble turned outlaw. In 1297, Wallace's forces defeated the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, using narrow terrain and surprise to crush a larger army. He was named Guardian of Scotland, though he never claimed the crown. Edward struck back with overwhelming force. At the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, English archers shattered the Scottish lines. Wallace escaped, but his campaign faltered. He was betrayed, captured in 1305, and brought to London in chains. There, he was tried for treason, though he insisted he owed no allegiance to England. His execution was savage. He was hanged, drawn and quartered. A public display meant to destroy both man and myth. But the myth only grew. While Wallace fell, another rebel rose. Robert the Bruce, a descendant of claimants to the Scottish throne, murdered a rival in a church and was excommunicated, but then crowned himself King of Scots in 1306. Edward, now in his late 60s, was enraged. Though sick and aging, he summoned his army once more. He rode north with grim resolve, determined to crush Bruce and end the rebellion forever. But fate intervened. In 1307, near the Scottish border, Edward died, in sight of the land he hoped to conquer. Legend says he asked his men to boil his bones and carry them into battle, so he might fight the Scots even in death. He was buried instead in Westminster Abbey, beneath a slab marked simply, "Here lies Edward, the hammer of the Scots." Edward I was many things: a brilliant legal reformer, a ruthless conqueror, a builder of castles, a monarch who believed in the majesty of kingship and the iron of war. But his conquests planted the seeds of centuries-long conflict. His policies toward the Jews too darkened his legacy. In 1290, he expelled all Jews from England, an edict that would not be reversed for over 350 years. Still, his vision of kingship, powerful, structured, imperial, set the tone for the English monarchy to come. And as his son Edward II took the crown, few could have guessed how quickly that vision would begin to unravel. Chapter 18. Edward II and the Fall of a King, 1307 to 1327 AD. The storm left by Edward I had barely settled before another, softer, stranger storm swept over England. Where the father had been steel, the son was silk. Where one carved kingdoms in stone, the other drifted like fog through courtly pleasure and perilous affection. This was the reign of Edward II, a king born to rule but never built for it. He was crowned in 1307 at the age of 23, young, tall, and handsome. But almost immediately, whispers began to stir in courtly corners. Not about war, not about taxes, but about a man. Piers Gaveston. A knight of minor nobility, Gaveston had been Edward's closest companion since youth. Some said their bond was fraternal. Others claimed it was romantic, scandalous for the time. What no one doubted was Edward's obsession. Upon taking the crown, Edward showered Gaveston with titles and lands. He made him Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for royalty, and placed him at the center of power, above even the great lords of England. To the barons, it was an insult. To the people, a mystery. To Edward it was loyalty returned. But to history it would be his undoing. The barons, led by Thomas of Lancaster and other powerful nobles, soon demanded Gaveston's exile. Edward sent him away, then brought him back. Twice. The final return in 1312 sparked open rebellion. Gaveston was captured by the barons, put on trial in haste and executed. Run through by sword and abandoned on a hillside. Edward was devastated. He wore mourning black for weeks, refused to attend councils and became more withdrawn, and more reckless. But Gaveston's death was not the end of scandal. It was only the beginning. In 1314, Edward marched north to reassert his father's dream of Scottish conquest. But Edward I was gone, and Robert the Bruce was very much alive. At Bannockburn, near Stirling, the English army, vastly larger, heavily armoured and overconfident, found itself trapped between Boggs and Bruce's skilled guerrilla fighters. It was a catastrophe. Hundreds of English knights were killed or captured. The rest fled. Scotland had not just resisted, it had triumphed, and Edward's reputation crumbled. Back home, Edward withdrew from governance, preferring the company of new favourites, most notoriously Hugh Despenser the Younger, and his father. The Despensers became the king's confidants, advisors, and political enforcers. They seized lands, humiliated barons, and provoked fresh waves of rebellion. In 1321, a full-scale baronial revolt erupted. Lancaster and his allies raised armies. Edward responded with rare effectiveness. He crushed the rebellion at Boroughbridge, captured Lancaster, and had him executed, marking a new, darker phase of his reign. Edward and the Despensers now ruled with a heavy hand. Executions, land seizures, and political purges followed. But while the barons feared him, the Queen began to plot. Isabella of France, Edward's wife, had long endured humiliation, ignored by her husband, overshadowed by his favourites. But she was clever, patient, and quietly ambitious. In 1325, Edward sent her to France to negotiate with her brother the French king. She went, but she did not return. Instead, she took a lover, the exiled marcher Lord Roger Mortimer, and began assembling an invasion force. In 1326, she and Mortimer landed in England with a small army. They marched through the country to cheers. The barons turned against Edward, his support evaporated. He fled with the Despensers, only to be captured days later. The Despensers met grisly ends. Hugh the Younger was hanged, drawn and quartered in public. And Edward? He was forced to abdicate in 1327, the first English monarch to be deposed by Parliament. His 14-year-old son, Edward III, was crowned in his place. Edward II was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, isolated and increasingly unstable. That September, he died under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed illness, others said murder, with whispered tales of torture, and a red-hot poker used in secrecy. Whether truth or invention, the story spread, and Edward passed into legend. He had ruled for 20 years, a reign of favoritism, defeat, and alienation, but also a reign that began the tradition of parliamentary deposition, a reminder that a king's power could be taken away, and in his absence, a new monarch would rise, young, ambitious, and ready to reclaim his family's fractured glory. Chapter 19. Edward III and the Age of Chivalry, 1327 to 1377 AD. In the chill of early February 1327, a boy of just 14 was crowned Edward III in Westminster Abbey. The halls echoed with hymns and hope. Outside, the people cheered, not merely for a new monarch, but for deliverance from the chaos of his father's rule. But behind the pageantry, a deeper truth lingered. The boy wore the crown, but his mother ruled. Queen Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, governed as joint regents. They spoke in the king's name, issued edicts, and punished dissent. Mortimer styled himself Earl of March and gathered lands, enemies, and infamy. For 3 years Edward watched and waited. He trained, observed, learned to wield both sword and silence. And then, in 1330, when he was just 18 years old, he struck. He and a small band of loyal knights stormed Nottingham Castle, where Mortimer was hiding. The rebel lord was seized, tried for treason, and hanged, without mercy. Isabella, though spared, was placed under house arrest and faded from public life. And Edward III emerged at last, a king in full. His reign began in ambition. He envisioned an England not merely at peace but powerful, an empire, a dynasty, a chivalric court of knights and poets. He revived his grandfather's claims to France, and in 1337 declared war on the Valois king, thus beginning the epic conflict that would dominate the next century, the 100 Years' War. It was not a single war, but a series of campaigns, interrupted by truces, plagues, and politics. But its foundation was laid in Edward's youth. In 1340, he declared himself King of France, claiming descent through his mother Isabella, who was sister to the last Capetian king. This was no idle boast. It was a war of crowns. And Edward meant to win it. The early battles were glorious. In 1346, Edward landed in Normandy with a large army and began marching toward Paris. The French king, Philip VI, gathered a massive force to oppose him. The two armies met at Crécy. There, English longbowmen, positioned behind wooden stakes, unleashed a hail of arrows that tore through the French ranks. Cavalry charges were repelled. Knights were cut down by peasants wielding bows. It was a slaughter. Crécy marked the dawn of a new military age, one where strategy and innovation could defeat sheer numbers. Edward's teenage son, Edward of Woodstock, soon to be known as the Black Prince, fought bravely at his father's side. Together they marched on.
In 1347, Edward laid siege to the great port city of Calais. After months of starvation and resistance, the city surrendered. But not before one of the most poignant episodes in medieval legend. Edward demanded that 6 of Calais' leading citizens surrender themselves barefoot in sackcloth, carrying the keys of the city and ropes around their necks, to be executed. But his queen, Philippa of Hainault, begged for mercy. Edward relented. The city was spared. and Calais would remain under English rule for over 2 centuries. It seemed the golden age of Plantagenet glory had returned. But even as the banners of England flew across the Channel, a darker shadow crept in from the east. In 1348, the Black Death arrived. It came by ship, rats and fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, first landing in Dorset, then sweeping through towns, monasteries, and manors like wildfire. No one was spared. By 1350, 1/3 to 1/2 of England's population had perished. Fields were abandoned, markets closed, priests died faster than they could be replaced. Whole villages vanished, names erased from maps forever. The plague did not distinguish king from commoner, and yet Edward, remarkably, survived. But the world he ruled was forever changed. Labour became scarce. Survivors demanded higher wages. The old manorial economy, with its rigid serfdom and feudal dues, began to crack. Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, trying to fix wages and bind workers to their lords. But the tide could not be held back. A new class of free peasants and wage workers began to emerge. Towns grew. The seeds of capitalism, faint and scattered, began to sprout. Edward's court responded with magnificence, as if to counter death with splendour. He founded the Order of the Garter in 1348, a fellowship of knights modelled on Arthurian legend, sworn to valour, loyalty, and honour. The motto, Honi soit qui mal y pense, shame on him who thinks evil of it. It was the flowering of chivalry, the high tide of medieval romance and ritual. But even golden ages do not last forever. In 1356, Edward's son, the Black Prince, won a spectacular victory at Poitiers, capturing the French king, John II, and bringing him back to London in chains. Yet, despite these triumphs, the war dragged on. Treaties were signed, then broken, territories gained, then lost. Edward, now aging, watched as his once mighty household began to decay. The Black Prince, once the flower of English knighthood, fell ill with dysentery. He returned from Spain in pain, never to recover. Edward's beloved queen, Philippa, died in 1369. His court fell into faction and intrigue. He grew frail and withdrawn, surrounded by favourites and servants who manipulated access to power. By the time he died in 1377, England was already shifting. Edward III had reigned for 50 years. He had revived royal authority, launched a great war, and presided over a court of dazzling culture. He gave England victories, castles, institutions, and the deep grief of plague. He embodied the ideals of medieval kingship, brave, ambitious, pious. But his last years were a reminder that glory fades, and the crown passed not to the Black Prince, who had died a year before, but to a child. Richard II, just 10 years old. A kingdom that had once marched boldly into France would now tiptoe into uncertainty. Chapter 20, Richard II and the End of the Medieval Dream, 1377 to 1399 A.D. The crown passed to a boy. Richard II, grandson of Edward III, was just 10 years old when he became king in 1377, a child draped in velvet and burdened with empire. He was crowned in Westminster Abbey, beneath the echoes of a golden age, with lords and bishops whispering promises of protection and guidance. But no child remains sheltered for long in a realm like England. Storms, some quiet, some roaring, gathered at his feet. The first came in 1381. The Black Death had returned in waves, thinning the population. shifting the balance of power between lord and labourer. With fewer workers and rising wages, England's peasant class grew bold, only to be shackled again by the poll tax, a fixed fee imposed on every adult, regardless of income. It was the match to dry tinder. In June of 1381, peasants in Essex and Kent rose in revolt, marching toward London under the banner of Wat Tyler. Alongside them walked preachers like John Ball, who cried out, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" It was not merely a protest. It was a reckoning. Tens of thousands flooded the streets of London, looting manors, burning tax records, even storming the Tower. They beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury. They murdered the king's treasurer. And Richard, just 14, rode out alone to meet them. In a moment of astonishing courage, he faced the mob at Smithfield, promised reforms, and defused the crisis. When Wat Tyler was suddenly struck down by the Lord Mayor of London, Richard did not panic. He cried out to the rebels, "You shall have no leader but me." They dispersed. The promises, of course, were not kept. The rebel leaders were hunted, and the old order was restored. But the world had changed. No longer could the nobility pretend that serfs were silent. Richard emerged from the peasants' revolt, crowned not only in gold, but in myth, and he believed it. He saw himself not merely as a king, but as a chosen vessel of God, destined to rule with majesty and poetry, surrounded by art and symbolism. He ordered elaborate processions, wore robes lined with golden suns, and filled Westminster with opulence and iconography. He styled himself Richard of Bordeaux, a monarch of refinement and intellect. But intellect is not armor, and his realm was restless. In the 1380s, the king's household was dominated by favourites, men of ambition, luxury, and political cunning. Chief among them, Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford. Richard elevated de Vere to Duke of Ireland, heaping wealth and trust upon him. The great lords, especially his uncle Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, grew resentful. A group of nobles, the Lords Appellant, rose to challenge the king's circle. In 1387, they defeated Richard's forces at Radcot Bridge. A year later, in the merciless Parliament, they executed or exiled many of the king's companions. Richard was humiliated, but he did not forget. And in 1397, he struck back. With time, cunning, and loyalty carefully rebuilt, Richard arrested the old Lords Appellant. Gloucester was murdered in captivity. Richard ruled as an absolute monarch, abolishing the informal councils of nobles, bypassing Parliament, and ruling by decree. He built up a network of spies and enforcers. His court became theatrical, brilliant, and frightening. Some called it tyranny. Richard called it majesty. In 1399, he made his boldest move. He exiled Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, his cousin and the son of John of Gaunt, a pillar of the royal family. When Gaunt died, Richard confiscated his estates. It was a fatal mistake. Henry returned that same year, claiming only his inheritance, but support grew quickly. Richard, campaigning in Ireland, returned too late. London welcomed Henry. Nobles and bishops defected. Parliament summoned Richard, not to council, but to judgment. And on a quiet autumn day, in a ceremony unlike any other, King Richard II resigned his crown. He handed over the orb and sceptre. He bowed his head. He signed a statement of abdication. Then he vanished. Imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, he died months later, starved, murdered, or both. He was just 33. His throne passed to Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king. The medieval age, once a tapestry of chivalry, crusade, and coronation, now bore the weight of rebellion, parliament, and deposition. Richard had been a child of kings, a patron of poets, a ruler who spoke in verse and dreamed in glass. But he had also ruled in fear and pride and retribution. His fall was not just the end of a reign. It was the end of an era. Final reflection: the long sleep of medieval England. Now, as the candle burns low and shadows lengthen along the stone walls of memory, we have come to the end of our long walk through medieval England. From the fading footprint of Roman sandals to the falling crown of Richard II, from the thunder of Viking oars to the flutter of royal banners above Westminster, from the hush of monasteries to the roar of rebellion, we have travelled nearly 1,000 years. And what remains? Only echoes now. But listen closely. They are still there. The murmur of a Saxon prayer in the dark of a wooden chapel, the clatter of hooves across muddy Norman fields, the cries of market stalls beneath cathedral spires, the gentle scratch of a monk's quill on vellum, copying a gospel by candlelight, the clang of sword against shield in the shadow of a keep, the silence of a plague-struck village, empty but for wind and graves, the weeping of a queen, the whisper of a king, the sigh of a nation trying to become itself. Let us linger here for a while and remember a land inherited. The story of medieval England begins not with a king, but with a void. When the Romans left in 410 AD, they left no blueprint, no heir, no order. They left silence, and into that silence crept warlords, wanderers, and would-be kings. The Saxons came not in armies, but in waves. Settlers at first, mercenaries next, then rulers in their own right. They carved kingdoms into the land: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex. They brought their gods and their songs. They gave names to rivers, to hills, to villages still marked on modern maps. They fought, they ruled, they dreamed. But they were not alone. In Wales and Cornwall, in the highlands of the north, older voices persisted: Britons, Picts, Scots. The island was never just one people. It never would be. And then, like a star falling from across the sea, the cross returned. Christianity spread once more, through monks with shaved heads and cloaks of rough wool. They taught kings to write. They lit the dark with Latin and hope. They built churches of stone, then cathedrals that kissed the sky. Faith gave unity, and ambition followed. A land conquered. When the Vikings came, it was not as tourists, but as fire. They burned the monasteries first, those quiet keepers of England's memory. Then they settled, building towns, trading, farming. The Danelaw was not just a place, it was a way of life. Then came Alfred, who read by candlelight and fought by dawn. He held the line, and from his line came kings who dreamed bigger. Athelstan, first king of all England. But unity is fragile, and power always invites challengers. In 1066, William the Conqueror crossed the Channel with sword and sanction. At Hastings, Harold fell. The Saxon age ended not with a peace treaty, but with a blade. The Normans built with stone and ruled with fear. Castles rose like mountains. French became the language of law. But beneath it all, English roots clung to the soil. In time, they would bloom again. A land crowned, the medieval kings were many things: warriors, reformers, tyrants, dreamers. Some ruled with vision, others with violence, a few with poetry. Henry II built laws. Richard the Lionheart went to war and never came home. King John, in losing his barons, gave rise to liberty. Parliament was born in the margins of rebellion, and power, slowly, subtly, began to shift. The people, once subjects, became something else, participants, not equals, not yet, but present. A land plagued. Then came the Black Death. It rode on fleas and silence. It emptied cottages and monasteries. It changed everything. In its aftermath, labourers became valuable. Serfdom began to crumble. The world turned upside down, and kings had to learn to rule differently. A land divided. The 100 Years' War gave glory and grief. Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt would echo in song. But beneath the triumph lay debt, exhaustion, and loss. The Order of the Garter, the glint of chivalry, the tournaments and tapestries, all flourished in the halls of Edward III. But the dream dimmed with Richard II. He ruled with mirrors and myth, saw himself as more than mortal. He ruled as if crowned by heaven, not consent. And when that consent dissolved, so did his crown. He handed it over, and with that gesture, something ancient ended, the long sleep. And now, here we are, dear listener, with the fire burned low and the story told. What is medieval England, if not a dream remembered through stone and song? It is 1,000 voices layered in the soil, Saxon and Norman, peasant and priest, widow and warrior. It is the slow shaping of a nation, not by one king, but by many, and by the people who endured them, by the scribes who copied, by the archers who fought, by the mothers who waited, by the builders who never signed their names. You are still here, still breathing softly in the quiet after the tale. Let the echoes settle now. Let the kings take their rest. Let the wars grow still. There will be other nights, other stories, other candles to light the past. But for now, rest. Let the centuries curl like smoke above your dreams and drift gently into sleep.